Hello and welcome back to another video. It is your host Weep Union, and in this one I'll be doing an in-depth analysis of Deepstatemap's map. And the reason for that is that I've been asked many times, especially with this specific update, what the hell is this? What is this update from Deepstatemap? According to Deepstatemap, the Russians occupy these 0.44 square kilometers in the northeastern outskirts of Andrivka. This is due to geolocated footage of their presence here. Now, what are we seeing? We're seeing that Deepstatemap has drawn that the Russians had a position here in the forest patch. Then they moved all the way to the outskirts of the town, got a foothold in the outskirts of the town, and the same here. They had a position in the forest line, and then they moved into the outskirts of the town and now have a foothold in the outskirts of the town. How are the Russian forces being supplied? Well, they go through a massive gray zone where the Ukrainian forces are not present. But would the Russian forces be present if the Ukrainians aren't? And this brings us to how Deepstatemap classifies the gray zone. They simply call it unknown. That is, Deepstatemap does not know if Russian forces are here or not. But logically speaking, if they are here, then they would naturally have some sort of supply line that goes through. And when there is a forest line that moves through from Petropavlivka all the way through to Andrivka, and the nearest Ukrainian position is a kilometer away, logically speaking, the Russians would have a proper supply line in that direction. And at the same time, when there's several layers of fortified positions in this entire area and the Ukrainian forces are not present, then any logical person would be able to look at it and think, well, if the Ukrainian forces are not present and the Russian forces are present at the outskirts of it, then the area in between the two areas would be under Russian control, because the Ukrainians cannot contest that control. And yes, Deepstatemap is reliable because in the end they are showing that the Russian forces are at the outskirts of Andrivka and have their foothold. They just do a bit of cope here and there, but they want to make up some magic scenario where the Russian forces don't really have as much as it seems. However, I would like to go a week back from this time. And if we take a look at it, the 20th of January, we see that the Russians were at the outskirts of Andrivka and the southeastern outskirts. They had just captured Shevchenko, and now they are fighting over the fortified positions in between Shevchenko and Petropavlivka. Then we see, as the days go by, the Russians are advancing on the northern flank, and then suddenly, a Ukrainian counterattack. The Ukrainian counterattack seems to have eliminated the Russian force because it is now a gray zone. That means that the Ukrainians have not secured the fortified positions on the outskirts of Andrivka, it is instead empty. And the Russian forces would not be there either. That is what Deepstatemap wants to tell us by putting it in a gray zone. However, if we continue, we see that the Russians then capture the area between Petropavlivka and Shevchenko and then make a push north of Andrivka. Well, now that it's empty, then they are free to go through. But they do not establish any positions. They must have been eliminated once they reached Andrivka. Again, that is what Deepstatemap is showing by coloring it as a gray zone and not under Russian control. Then we see the gray zone expands. So every time the Russians advance, they are simply eliminated. Then suddenly, they just, out of nowhere, establish positions in the forest lines and get a foothold within Andrivka, despite it being a gray zone for the past couple of days. From Deepstatemap's perspective, that would mean that the Russians had been trying for multiple days to get a foothold within Andrivka. Most of these assaults would have been defeated, and therefore, in the end, the Russians would have gained a foothold in the northeastern outskirts of Andrivka through their positions in these forest patches. These are the origin of the Russian forces within the town. They moved from these forest patches and into the town. However, a different way to look at it would be that the Russians actually succeeded in their previous assaults and weren't defeated. Instead, what we see is that the Russians, here to the north of Andrivka, were moving through these fortified positions, gained a foothold within him, moved on to the forest patch, and then switched from offensive to defensive, where the objective then became to hold these frontline positions to then launch further offensive operations once they have established a supply line. And if we take a look at the fortified positions, it makes a lot of sense, because there is a fortified position directly from Shevchenko connected to the forest patch. This would mean that the Russians have occupied these fortified positions. They now have their positions within the forest patch and then moved on towards Andrivka. And similarly, from Petrobevlivka down through the forest lines, through the fortified positions, and then from there down towards Andrivka. There, it makes a lot of sense. The Russians captured the fortified positions and moved from them. Well, that would mean that the Russians occupy this area, they have control of it. It's not unknown. Because logically speaking, if a fortified position is empty and your enemy moved through it, then the enemy would have control of it. And this has completely changed the way I look at Deepstatemap's mapping. Because if we take a look at Toretsk, for example, right now we see Toretsk is covered in red and gray. The gray areas are known, and the red areas is where the Russian forces have been geolocated. The Russian forces were actually geolocated to be in the northern outskirts here along the fortified positions over a week ago. Yet, just now, we see that the Russians occupy it according to Deepstatemap. But we have to go all the way down to the 13th of January. That is when it became a gray zone. That is when the first geolocated footage came out. That's actually 2 weeks ago now. Yet it took the Ukrainians' Deepstatemap 2 weeks before they admitted that the Russians were there. And that is because, according to their logic, the Russians didn't control the area. The Ukrainians were just defeated in the area and were not present there anymore. And this brings me to the conclusion that the gray zone isn't unknown. It's simply where the Russians have advanced to, it's where they're present within. While the red areas are really areas where the Ukrainians have attempted to counterattack or have seen Russian forces have established positions. That means that they have looked and they have seen Russian forces. If they have not looked and seen Russian forces, then it's a gray zone because the Ukrainian forces are not there either. Therefore, by default, it's a gray zone, and it's only a red zone, a Russian occupied zone, once they have seen Russian forces. And this completely changes the way Deepstatemap is looked at, because, for example, here, southwest of Bahatir, this shows that the Russians have launched a push towards Bahatir at some point. And if we take a look at when it happened, we can see that on the 21st of January, the Russians pushed towards Bahatir. Since then, the Ukrainians have not launched a counterattack, and the Russians have not followed up on that attack. At least not to Deepstatemap's knowledge. Therefore, we can get a lot more information from Deepstatemap. And I just wanted to share this video to give an insight on what sort of stuff I do besides doing the updates, how I need to analyze different maps, how I need to analyze how they do it, because Deepstatemap does not go out and say, this is how I do it, this is the logic, this is the things, everything, because a map like Deepstatemap would not be as popular as it is without some sort of logic behind it. So I have to identify that and determine what does it mean to understand how I can use it for my own mapping. And based on this, we can also determine that not every single time that the Ukrainians recapture some territory, they actually recapture it. Instead, sometimes it's simply that the Ukrainians managed to defeat an advancing Russian force, or the advancing Russian force withdrew from their advanced positions, where they simply identified that the Ukrainian positions were too powerful, so they had to withdraw, reorganize, and launch a different offensive to actually succeed. Sometimes they drop off infantry in the forest lines and then try to hold on to their positions for the next one to arrive and be more successful, because at that point the Russian forces at the frontline positions can prevent the Ukrainians from putting new minefields, from putting up positions and holding positions in the area and so on. So there's a lot more to analyze based on this new information. So I'll keep this in mind going forward to better analyze the situation. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you for watching and have a great day.